Yes, that is correct. Type Soul has lore, and in today's video I will be explaining, compiling, and showing you the lore that hides deep within Type Soul, involving lore characters, the non-canon items from outside of Bleach, and of course, the characters in Bleach who may or may not exist in Type Soul, and all the other deep hidden lore I could find. And I mean deep, because barely any of it matters as far as the game goes. Make sure to subscribe, since only about 20% of the people watching right now are actually subscribed. And also, I'm live on Twitch. Come watch me on Twitch. I'm live on Twitch right now. I'm live Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 3 times a week. I'm live on Twitch. Now let's get straight into it. Alright, so first of all, Type Soul has a slightly altered timeline in comparison to Bleach. Essentially, everything before Thousand Year Blood War all happened in normal order. So everything up to the Fullbringer arc happened before the recent Hell update. And I know, to some of you it might not make sense, because Fullbringers technically just came out, but as far as lore concerns go, they've always existed in-game, they just weren't playable yet. Now, where the timeline gets a bit messy is with the Hellverse, which is both technically canon and entirely non-canon. Hell is a real place in the Bleach universe, however the Hell arc of the manga is not out yet, so everything in Type Soul's Hellverse is, in fact, non-canon to Bleach, unless for some reason Bleach wants to base their next major manga arc around a Roblox game. Along with that, the Thousand Year Blood War has not happened yet in Type Soul, as it is planned to be their next major update. This means that the Type Soul timeline is completely normal and canon to Bleach up until the Fullbringer arc, at which point the Thousand Year Blood War and Hell arcs are actually switched around chronologically, and I'm assuming that they're going to be pretty different from each other because of course Ichigo can't save the Soul Society in Type Soul. Now along with that, there is an alteration to the Bleach timeline as far as lore figures go, where they're kind of just inserted in between other characters. So all of the devs involved within the game at some point have replaced important figures in the Bleach world in their positions. This doesn't mean that the original person holding the title or position doesn't exist, it just means the developer in lore either precedes or follows after the original person. For example, Prox Du, the Fear Sternritter, right? I believe this is Christie's lore character, I'm not completely sure, but the Fear in Bleach is Ass Not. In lore, Prox Du is a previous F for Fear Sternritter before Asnot, seeing as how the Thousand Year Blood War hasn't happened yet. You could also consider it kind of like an alternate universe or timeline to Bleach, right? Along with boss and lore characters like Ryuroi Zaraki, who is titled in-game as the first Kenpachi, meaning they predate both Unohana and Kenpachi Zaraki. Now this is inconsistent though, seeing as how Kenpachi's last name technically isn't Zaraki. Zaraki is just where Kenpachi was born, and Kenpachi is a given name which is supposed to be the strongest. So while they call him Kenpachi Zaraki, his given name is Kenpachi of Zaraki, which it's just Zaraki, or it's been shortened to Kenpachi Zaraki as like a last name, with Kenpachi being more of a title than a name given to him, which is also why Unohana was in lore of actual Bleach known as the first Kenpachi. Now I guess the lore character of Ryuroi specifically just also happens to be from Zaraki. Along with these dev bosses, the lore characters come a bit inconsistent, and there's a lot of nonsensical lore additions to it, so let me list them out real quick. Dark Fang, the head captain, who assumingly predates both Yamamoto and Shunsui, which, you know, that has its own problems because that means that this person is thousands of years old, predates basically the entire verse minus, like, Ikome Kodomoe. And then there's Cassie Fang, the Unohana, which doesn't really make sense, right? Because unlike Kenpachi, right, Unohana isn't a title. So while the title of Unohana in this context, which is why they call her the Unohana, is meant to be the female Kenpachi, this doesn't make sense because Unohana in Bleach is actually just a name, and they're treating it like it's a title when it isn't. Then we have Data Bach, the Almighty, who we can only assume is serving in as the Almighty before Yhwach is freed from his 1,000-year rest. Then there's Min Stark, a probably descendant of Coyote Stark, and the new king of Hueco Mundo, which that has its own problems with it because what happened to like Baragon and everyone else? I know they're kind of dead, but also like, why are you the king? Where's everyone else at? Isn't Hollowbell alive? Whatever, right? And then there's the two bullshit king titles, Callan Jaggerjack and Josh Jaggerjack, right? Who are the Tiger King and the Bone King respectively. And neither of these titles mean anything or have any relevance to the game other than Callan may be gay and own big tigers, right? And I don't know, because these titles actually mean nothing. You're the Tiger King, which, you know, it doesn't really make sense. He wears tiger print, so I guess it could literally just be the Tiger King, like Joe Exotic. But then there's Josh, who's the Bone King. which, what do you mean you're the king of bones? You're ruling over bones? That's lame. That's lame, man. You're ruling over bones. That doesn't mean anything. Now, in-game, it's also just a little bit of a weird inconsistency. But in-game, despite their titles being the Bone King and the Tiger King, they are both also the kings of Hueco Mundo, with Stark, or well, Min Stark also being the king of Hueco Mundo. So it means one of two things. Either Min Stark, who is supposed to be the true king, is the king, and these two are princes of some sort, and maybe it just calls them the king of Hueco Mundo for some reason. Or these two are previous kings of Hueco Mundo, which might be what it is, and then they just have different titles. So Min Stark would be the current king, and then Josh and Callan Jaggerjack would be the Bone King and the Tiger King, who were ex-kings named based on, I don't know, some sort of characteristic about them. So the Bone King, for example, he wore bone armor, so maybe they called him the Bone King. Callan wore Tiger Prince, so they called him the Tiger King. So I think it could just be that they're ex-kings, but you know, with this game's messy lore, it's kind of hard to tell. Now, all of this lore regarding the developers and their characters was actually established back when the game was in a CC period. So for those of you who don't know, Type Soul used to be a CC, or a closed community game, and during this period was when many of the titles were established with important lore events like the battles that the devs had in competition for titles of regality, like the Bone King. Now, most of this is actually just bullshit stored in the Discord's lore channel, along with outdated memes and, you know, just developer conversations and rants. But essentially, every fight documented in there happened in lore and shaped the Type Soul world in some way. Now, an interesting piece of lore that may or may not be canon is involvement with clans, right? Because we all know that there is the Ikomi Kodomowe clan, which realistically shouldn't exist, because Ikomi Kodomowe was like a powerful hollow that was sealed away and kind of is like the life energy for the world. So the Ikomi Kodomowe monster shouldn't be a last name, right? Because it doesn't make sense for it to be a last name when it wasn't even a name. It was just like the title for an interdimensional monster that they had to seal away. So assuming that the Ikomi Kodomowe clan has any merit here, it means that you're a part of that big hollow thing that kind of like gave birth to the world. I don't know, maybe you're like part of its soul that humanized and became an Arankar, and that's where the clan comes from, but I don't know. Now, as for the items of the game, right, many of them are quite important. A vast majority of items are kind of just multiversal artifacts which are fought over for their great power, and this is pretty much why raids happen in game, right? Because obviously there's always been dominion and war over territory, which is, you know, it's a common theme in Bleach with the Arankars and the Soul Reapers and the Quincy's. Even outside of the fact that they're fighting for power, a lot of them fight for territory. But raids are the product of fighting over land and dominion, so it becomes easier to obtain various legendary relics, which is why there's, you know, the various drops and the legendary items and all that, which it's the same with Clan Wars. Now, how do these items get into the game? Well, the easiest explanation is the Yamato, although apparently a lot of them just, you know, have unknown origin, which I'll get into a bit later, but the Yamato is the legendary sword from Virgil of Devil May Cry. And the Yamato is the easiest explanation for how every other item in the game has come from the multiverse and made its way into Type Soul. But how did the Yamato get into Type Soul? Well, it kind of goes pretty deep into Devil May Cry lore, so if you've never played Devil May Cry, check out my live channel where I made a video playing all the Devil May Cry games. Essentially, the Yamato is a sword with the power of division. It can divide anything and cut anything, making it possible for it to even open dimensional rifts. Now, after the events of Devil May Cry 3, the sword was shattered, leaving it in a bunch of pieces before the events of Devil May Cry 4, where the sword resonates with Nero and is fixed. Yes, I know DMC3 is before 1 and 2, but the sword was broken for all that time. Anyway, while the sword was broken, and before the events of Devil May Cry 4, one of the shards just happened to cut a little piece of space-time, and it decided to just drift outside of time and space, where it eventually found and landed its way into Type Soul as the Dimensional Shard, which can be resonated with because I guess hollows and demons are pretty similar, and it makes a new sword out of the shard, which I'm assuming it's like an alloy, like you only have like the tip of the sword is the Yamato and then the rest is just regular steel, and it's like an alloy of like magic steel that kind of, you get the point, right? Anyway, after the events of Devil May Cry 5, Virgil decides to look for the missing piece, which is found by whoever, but generally the player, and I'm assuming that's why, you know, he fights you, because he wants his sword back. And the Yamato's ability to divide, well, I'm assuming this isn't actually lore, but I'm assuming that the Yamato's ability to divide kind of affects the player and maybe their DNA over time, changing you into more and more of a demon, which is why devil triggers are now a thing that exist in game. Now, this isn't confirmed, but I'm kind of just logicking my way through this with the information Setro gave me. Anyway, the Yamato is the main form of interdimensional travel that could be used, allowing for the obtainment of all the other non-bleach items like the Serum W and the Murasama. The other way that items, that aren't canon come into existence is through wishes, right? So you get the Hogyoku Ball item, for example, which allows you to grant wishes, and then for like 5 of them you can get stuff like the Red Mist. And this is another example of just stuff that isn't canon making its way into the game. So I guess you could just wish for stuff. So if I want to say, hey, I wish for Goku Kami Hamama, then they just give it to me. Now, really funny, but everything else in the game without lore just has an unknown origin, and I'm not joking. The Quincy version of Unstable, for example, is just listed to have an unknown origin, and that's literally it, and anything that isn't explained just has an unknown origin. Anyway, that was a bit of the incoherence that is Type Soul's lore. I kind of just had to sift through absolute idiocy to find this stuff, because the lore channel is useless, and I just had to ask various developers different questions and stuff involving items and all that. Funny lore piece, but if you're a Quincy player and you're not a Stern Ritter, you canonically don't exist, since you can't have a Shrift and not be a Stern Ritter. Also, funnily enough, but a vast majority of the accessories don't have lore, but every once in a while they'll make an accessory that just has like a ton of lore, right? So the Crimson Spider Lily, for example, has an entire explanation on how it exists, and it's basically a flower that was once buried in the old ruins of Karakura, fusing with a Blood Medic's Shikai and Tears, and a Berserk Shikai's Rageful weapon to properly allow the flower to live without soil. Once used by Beppo, stolen by Tang, it slowly withers. So, of course, this comes from Tang Shutara, who is the captain of the 2nd Division boss. Now, this thing just has infinitely more lore than a vast majority of all the other, things in the game. Because then you have items like the Strongest Shades, which are just supposed to be Gojo's glasses, and its description is just, you crying. Are we serious? Are we serious? That's so stupid. That is so dumb. But then there's also some lore and other things like the Benevolent Scarlet Crown, which, after Draco's fight with Chaotic, which this is just 2 devs fighting, this is more the lore stuff that comes from the early CC stuff. He basically escaped from hell with, missing eye, and he used the remains of his broken hollow mask and his blood, or the blood of a medic or something like that, and he made the Benevolent Scarlet Crown. So some of the things have good lore, and then other things just don't. Anyway, shoutouts to YouTube members Green, Brick, Goobka, Pickle, High Card, and Drizzy Drake Fan. I love you all, have an amazing day, and goodbye.